Sorry, I'll just do that. Great. Okay. Lovely. Let's start. My name is Fiona Stager. I co-own Avid Reader in Brisbane, and I'm delighted that you're all here to join us in what I know will be a wonderful conversation. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on where I sit, and that's Yagara and Turrbal, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And because we're going out across Australia, I acknowledge all of the traditional owners on this vast land. This is a land that people have farmed, fished, made families, told stories, sung songs for generation after generation. Now, because this is on Zoom, we're encouraging you to use social media, tweet, let people know that you're here, let people know that Hanne's book is out in the world. If you're going to be sending us any questions, you can do that in the chat. I'll make sure that we leave time at the end for questions. And what else do I have to say? Oh, yes, a special welcome to people downstairs at Avid Reader. There's a watch party happening as well. So hello downstairs. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Hanne Kent. Hanne Kent, as we know, is the author of Burial Rites and The Good People, which are both being adapted to film. And she and her wife have two beautiful children, and they live in South Australia. Welcome, Hanne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming here tonight virtually and to the party in Avid Reader Bookstore. It's such a pleasure to speak to you all. And I'm speaking to you from Paramount Country, also known as the Adelaide Hills.
Great. Now, I love devotion so much. I just want to dive straight into it. There's so much for us to chat about. So congratulations. It's just so beautiful. It starts in 1836. That's where the story begins. Can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, sure. Devotion is narrated by a character called Hanne, who, when the book opens, is a teenage girl. She is the daughter of an elder in the Old Lutheran church in a small village in Prussia known as K. Many of the people living in K belong to this same congregation, and when the novel opens, they're being persecuted for their faith. This is a community who has refused to subscribe to King Frederick William III's new Union Church. They're refusing to adopt his new service book. And as a result, they are being imprisoned and fined. Their church has been barred, and they now have to hold their services in the local forest. And Hanne is aware of this persecution of her family. But really, as a younger woman, she is most concerned when the novel opens about her own freedoms. She is someone who has always been nature's child. She loves to be outside. She has a curious kind of synesthesia where she hears the land talk to her. She hears weather. She feels that trees sing to her. But by the time the book is open, she's reached an age where her parents are aware of the societal role, really the only societal role that she can go forwards into, that being a dutiful wife and mother, have started to limit her freedoms and are encouraging her to learn domestic duties. And being thrust back in this domestic world, Hanne is realizing that she has nothing in common with her peers. She's incredibly lonely. She's a twin, and her twin brother, Matthias, accepts her and understands her, but she's very much a bit of an outsider, even within her own congregation. And then soon after the book opened, there are newcomers to the village of K. And amongst these newcomers who are seeking religious freedom as well is their daughter, Thea. And Thea and Hanne strike up an immediate and all-encompassing friendship. And that's probably where I'll start to leave it.
Because the connection between Hanne and the natural environment is extraordinary. I just thought it was so beautifully written, and how it's almost like nature is a cathedral for her. You can see that she really has this beautiful spiritual connection to the plants and to the land. I was very moved by it. And you mentioned Thea, her friend who comes with her family, and her mother is Anna Maria, and she is a Vend. Could you tell us who a Vend is, or what being a Vend means?
Yeah, sure. So quite early on in when I was reading about these old Lutheran congregations, I kept on coming across people or stories of the Vends, who were essentially a Slavic minority who lived all throughout Prussia at this time and often intermarried with more sort of German families, but had their own language. And the reason why they often came up is because even though they belonged to these old Lutheran congregations, many of them, they were fellow dissenters, they were sometimes regarded with some suspicion because they were considered to be superstitious. They would have a lot of sort of folkloric remedies or stories that they believed in. And some of the old Lutheran people belonging to these communities thought that they were perhaps a little bit not entirely acceptable within the church. And so when I kept encountering these fantastic stories and these sorts of people, I was really interested in the Vendish culture, and I thought, well, how wonderful to have a character to come amongst this very tight-knit, conservative community, and in many ways provide the narrator, this girl Hanne, with an alternative way of being. I think Hanne has been raised in K her whole life. Her parents, her father is completely set on God. Everything revolves around his religion. He takes his duties as a church elder very seriously. He's blind actually in one eye, and he talks about it being his holy eye. So even though he cannot see the things of the earth, he sees things only of heaven, of God's intentions. And her mother is a woman who is very determined to fulfill the expectations of an elder's wife. And she's also someone who has experienced loss, and rather than making this making her a compassionate person, has hardened her a little towards her daughter. So when Anna Maria comes with her daughter Thea, they offer in, I guess, their aspects of their difference, their slight cultural differences, their embracing of more mysterious aspects of human existence, an interesting comparison for Hanne to make to her own parents.
And because Anna Maria also is in the possession of a book, and that's the 6th and 7th book of Moses. Now, I knew nothing about this, and like so many moments in your story, I was racing off and Googling, and I just love that. I love it when a book makes me want to go somewhere else and go down the rabbit hole. So, but tell us, what is the 6th and the 7th book of Moses?
So this was something quite extraordinary that, again, I kept on hearing about when I was reading about these old Lutheran communities, both in Prussia and also in the places where they ended up emigrating, including, and it's not really a spoiler to say so, in the colony of South Australia. And the reason this book kept on being mentioned mainly because it kept on causing conflict within these communities. The 6th and 7th books of Moses are essentially an apocryphal text. It was supposed to be books that were biblical but had been left out of the Bible, directions dictated to God, from God to Moses on Mount Sinai. And the 7th book is largely a book of, it exists, you can find it in German. It exists, the 7th book is mainly herbal cures, everything from, recommendations to avoid sleepwalking to ways in which you can cure a cough or a bleeding nose, quite mild things. But the 6th book has something which is slightly more occultish. There are ways in which you can, cast curses on your enemies and, invoke demons to assist you. And so you can and there's a conversation with Satan in it and things like that. And you can kind of see very easily why people were suspicious of this text, although those who possessed it within these congregations really believed that they were God-given and that they should have recourse to them. But the Lutheran Church soon started stamping down on it, and pastors started, raiding houses for it. When I was I've based a lot of this book on the town of Harndorf, which is a small sort of Germanic village, which was settled on Paramount country at a place known as Buckatilla. And there is an original cottage sort of from, the late 1830s that exists there. And I was taken by a local historian into that cottage, and you can see in the chimney the place where people used to hide this book away from the eyes of the pastor. And I kept on hearing about these crazy sort of instances of witchcraft as well in Barossa communities. Many of you might be familiar with the Barossa as this wonderful sort of source of so much about wine, which is heavily influenced by German viticulture and food culture. There's stories there of people using this book and milking rope ends to get milk when they don't have a cow, and of people being suspicious of neighbors and wearing red ribbons around their necks to avoid being, hexed. All sorts of things. I just kept on finding it. And I thought, I am just, even to be historically accurate, I'm going to have to include this magical text, this grimoire. And, as soon as you throw something like that into a novel, you also find all sorts of necessary conflict between the people who possess such a text and what it offers them, and also the people who are, disgruntled or about it, or outright, just afraid of it too. So yeah, it was just something that was just too good not to include in a book like
Oh yes. And was it both men and women who possessed the book?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I found lots of instances of men owning it. There was a story of a coffin being dropped 3 times before it was buried, because this man was rumored to have possession of this text, and they wanted to make sure that evil was, got out of the coffin or something beforehand. And I think the story of someone milking rope ends to get milk was a man as well. Yeah.
So you mentioned Hahndorf and that you lived close to there. What was the initial idea that prompted the story?
It's a good question. I think what led me to start researching these communities wasn't necessarily the communities themselves, but a longing to write about place. I love the Barossa. I think it's an incredibly evocative landscape. And I was thinking after finishing The Good People how I was wondering whether I was ready to write about Australia. And I thought, if I do, where would I set it? Where in Australia? And I hadn't necessarily considered the Adelaide Hills, because that just felt a little too close to home. So I thought the Barossa is somewhere, I'm descended from many people who lived there. I'm familiar with that area. It's incredibly beautiful. It would be a privilege to try and write about it. And also, there's not that many books set there. There are some, but there's not that many. And so I started considering that place. And then, knowing that it was going to necessarily be historical, I started looking at the people who established the modern townships, also on Paramount country there. And that's when I started getting drawn into the worlds of these old Lutherans who, in the 1830s set out from Hamburg and spent 6 months on awful ships to arrive, and then set up these very, very closed communities for many years. It was still not, many people within these communities were not really permitted to marry outside them until the 20th century. So I just kind of fell into the subject matter. And alongside this interest in landscape came, I knew after writing Burial Rites and The Good People that I was ready to step away from dark subject matter. I had spent 6 years in total by that time researching very grim things, murders and deaths and executions. And I was glad I wrote those books, and I felt that they had to be written at that time. But when I knew for my third one, I was ready to step away into something that was not necessarily more superficial, but something that was geared towards celebration, or just was not quite so bleak at the end. And I was considering, alongside thinking about the landscapes of South Australia and why they appealed to me, about writing a book of friendship. I was really interested in, and as soon as I started hearing about these congregations and learning more about them, I was really fascinated by the women, because they were so often absent from the narrative. And I was thinking about how friendship surely sustained them on the journey, and then, inevitably when they came out here. And I thought, though, that's something that's worth celebrating. That's something I can write about. So those were the initial sort of seeds that fed into my interest, both in, I guess, the subject matter of Prussian emigration in the 1830s and that backdrop of, I remember talking to Ron Rash once for an interview, and he told me that many of his ideas and books and things originate as just a vision, just almost like a tableau in his mind. And I had that for this one, and I couldn't ignore it. It was this vision of, fields of wheat in the Barossa. And so I just kept on coming back to that. And eventually I thought, well, maybe I can marry all of this together. And that was really where it started. And then it, of course, deviates, as books do. They shift and change with various interests, but that was really how it originated.
Wonderful. So you mentioned place, and you do place so beautifully. So we start in the village of Kay, and we really get a sense of farming life, daily life, everything from the river to the forest and to the orchards. And then, of course, we've got that strong sense of place in South Australia. But in the middle section, like the sense of place on the boat where the villagers are coming out is so visceral. Like I felt every knock of the boat, every smell of the rotting herring, and like I'm one of those people that I've never really wanted to go sailing. You know, some people say, oh, I'm going to sell everything and sail around the world. I've never been one of those people. And now I am definitely not one of those people, because the last thing I want to do is get on a boat. Like you've done that so well. So what research did you do for or maybe tell us why, just quickly, why the villagers left, and then the research involved in creating what their life was like for 6 months on a leaky boat?
Yeah, so in the book, these communities receive word from their pastor, who has fled to London, that he's met someone, George Fife Angus, who is a real person, a Scottish businessman, who has agreed. He's sympathetic to their cause, and he's agreed to fund their travel to the colony of South Australia. He's the chairman, I think, of the South Australian Company, which has recently been founded, and he's keen to sort of, he has his own interests. He'll get interest, financial interest on the money that he lends, and he'll also be able to supply laborers. These are people of a peasant class. He'll be able to supply laborers to the new colony, which currently has not necessarily been worked in that, English sense. So he offers them money, and they are able to emigrate to South Australia, which is a place they've not really heard of before. And I knew that I would include at least some of the boat journey, because it's a necessary part of what happens to these people and what would happen to my characters. But I was really concerned about it, because I'm a modern person. I'm not a boater or a sailor. I don't even know the word for it. I'm not a sailor. I don't know how to sail. And I've certainly never been on a 3-masted ship like this, and I would have no idea what it would be like to experience. And so I started sort of digging around for, I don't know, I was hoping for, I guess, journal entries or letters from passengers who might have described elements of it. And then I stumbled in the South Australian State Library on the journals of Captain Hahn, who was the captain of the ship Zebra, which was the third ship of these Prussian immigrants out from Hamburg to Port Misery, as Port Adelaide was nicknamed back then for very obvious reasons. Some would argue that it hasn't changed that much, but that's not for me to say. And this log was initially so dry. You can imagine, it's just he's a captain. He's quite annoyed at having to take emigrants. He would rather take goods. He's never been to Adelaide before, but he talks about taking it on. There's a lot of very dry maritime and nautical information. He has this chronometer which won't work properly, and he sort of, is very angry about it. And I was sort of reading it, but I was picking up little details about the immigrants as I was reading it. He was talking about how they used to sing all the time. They used to sing morning and night. And when they were still at harbour and not yet set sail, people would come on board just to hear them sing. So I'd get these like really interesting little details, these sort of flashes of the human face. And then I got to the end of these journals, and the captain has added in this particular publication an epilogue in which he says that his initial assessment of the immigrants that he initially published at the beginning of the journals, where he said they were pious and hardworking and he had no issue with them, was false, and that he hadn't actually included all the information. And then comes this amazing account of the journey where people are fighting, like there's brawling, these pious immigrants are squabbling over bacon rations and herring. There's a hugely incompetent doctor on board who the immigrants hate because they think he's actually actively trying to poison them by adulterating his medicines with like crushed glass. At one stage, he comes up to the captain and says he thinks he's come up with a new smallpox vaccine and wants to trial it on board. And this is a live vaccine, and the captain's like, no way, you can't introduce smallpox onto it. So all of this amazing stuff. And the reason why the captain wrote all of it down is because he thought it would go to trial and he would have to appear as a witness. So it's incredibly meticulous in these accounts of all these various conflicts. And of course, as a novelist, you stumble upon something like this. And the narrative I grew up with, living so close to Handorf and the Barossa, of these, this almost hagiographic kind of a portrait of a people who are stoic and hardworking, which is true. There are elements there. It's kind of completely shattered by these very human desires and mistakes and flaws. And I mean, that was the moment where I thought, oh, this is more than enough. I have so much here that I can write this journey, I can base on this journey. And so I incorporated a huge amount of that information into the book because it was just too good not to. And it was really a lot of the people within that ship set up Handorf, hence Hahn, Captain Hahn. I named it after him.
Right. Oh, good. Oh, lovely.
So I ended up leaning very hard on that particular journey and that particular boatload of immigrants.
And just in terms of names, you said Captain Hahn for Handorf. Like Hannah, the main character, our narrator, her name is very similar to your name. Why do that? What was the decision making around that?
You know what, I'm not entirely sure. She didn't have that name for most of the draft. I changed it mainly because the name I had picked was not common. I realized it wasn't very common at that time. Within these congregations, you find the same names used over and over again. And I thought it would be interesting for her to have the same name as her mother, which is Johanna, which was a very common name. But of course, she would probably have some sort of nickname instead of, because her mother had the full one. So I thought of Hannah. And I think normally I would just, I don't know, I would never really name a character so closely after my own name. And to some degree, I think of her as very separate. But there was so much in, I think, this book is a very personal one to me in a myriad of ways. And I think of all the characters I've ever sort of written, I feel the closest personal connection to Hannah. And I think that was my very obvious little nod to that, particularly the younger Hannah. I was someone who grew up very much at home in nature. I always felt that it was wonderful company, and it was such a wonderful, strong presence in my own childhood, living in such a beautiful place as this. And I think also an element of Hannah's difficulty when she feels that she doesn't quite fit in. I think I've always felt like a bit of an outsider in that regard. So yeah, maybe there was just, it felt right for some reason. It felt like it fitted. Yeah.
Great. So we have our villagers who survived that horrendous boat trip, and they arrive in South Australia, which of course is not an empty country at all. How did you negotiate the politics of invasion and colonization?
This was a really big one for me. I think it's probably the one reason why I hadn't written about I hadn't set a historical novel in Australia beforehand, is because I obviously find so much of the colonization of South Australia and of Australia completely appalling and abhorrent. And I have no desire to celebrate the colonization of South Australia. And yet I'm not Indigenous, and I know that I would never write from the perspective of an Aboriginal character, because that's not my culture, that's not my place to take up, that's not my voice to appropriate. It would feel like appropriation for me, and would sort of go against a lot of what a lot of my feelings about that. And so I would necessarily have to adopt the perspective, at least, of a white settler oppressor. And that too holds very little appeal, because even if you're writing essentially a sympathetic character, you necessarily have to hold true to the ideologies and biases and prejudices of that time. And there was no way that I really wanted to do that either. I didn't want to inhabit that mentality. And I didn't know how to get around it, really. I think also there's so much of historical fiction, to me, I think, can easily be seen to celebrate the past. And I didn't want to do that, in this case. So I think it wasn't until I really started thinking about this particular story and also decided to kind of change my usual methodology of really honoring the historical record that I found a way that I could get around it to a certain degree. And I'm not necessarily sure I've been successful in that, but I've tried to avoid adopting that colonialist mindset within this book by just shaking things up, creatively speaking. But yeah, it was certainly something that I gave a lot of thought to, and I tried to do as much research as possible in regards to the nature of the interactions between the Peremank and the Prussians, keeping in mind all the while that all the accounts I came across were written by white Prussians. So you're only ever getting one side of the story. So yeah, it was a really tricky one. I was really fortunate to speak to a wonderful local writer and Peremank elder, Mandy Brown, who read a draft of my script and of my novel, and offered some really wonderful perspectives that I was able to incorporate. And also just the chats that we had more generally kind of really made me consider, especially some of the more supernatural elements in the book. And it was really a wonderful thing to do. But yeah, it was, I think, trying to avoid a colonist narrative was one of the reasons why I thought I'm not going to base this, even though I can use the historical record to inform aspects of the book. The characters are fictional. This community is fictional. The village is not called Harndorf in the book. It's something entirely different. And that freed me, I guess, to do things my own way. Yeah.
And just in terms of other research, so you found the diary and speaking with elders and people around the community, what other research did you do? Because like the research is so extraordinary. You had me going, oh, I love needlework. So when you use the term white stitch embroidery, I'm online looking, what is white stitch embroidery? And all the food, some of it, I kind of turned my stomach, but other times I was thinking, oh, I must go and get some sauerkraut. And then there's a lot about religious songs. There's the Germanic phrases. How and where did you do that kind of research?
The research took quite a long time with this book. It was quite sporadic in nature, mainly because I had other work going on and other sort of commitments. But because I'm not a historian and I don't really have a good plan when it comes to research, often because I like to let the research guide me creatively. It's not like I'm like, well, I know what my book's about, but I don't know enough about this, so I'm going to go find out. I just kind of, cast a wide net and read everything. So, I mean, I read recipe books and old church documents, the 6th and 7th books of Moses. I was translating from, Gothic script German late at night in my room, the kind of thing where you're translating it very slowly because I don't speak German. And then you realize you're doing the translation for demon invocation. You're thinking, I hope the demon knows I'm just doing this for research purposes. But yeah, I read, because I was initially interested in looking at friendship between these German women in these communities, I thought, where am I going to find the stories? I'm going to find them in accounts of the food culture, in these sorts of domestic arts. And so I was really lucky, actually. There was a wonderful exhibition on in the Barossa where people had taken these old crafts of the German immigrants and had sort of repurposed them to create modern works. And one of the things that they talked about a lot within this exhibition was white work. And I was so struck by it because white work, which is embroidery of white thread upon white cloth, was something that was used by these women to sort of create, for instance, altar pieces and things for the church, but was thought to be very modest, very humble. It wasn't ostentatious, it wasn't flashy, but it was nonetheless an opportunity for them to show their skill. And having spoken by that stage to other historians and people who had known, descendants of these women and the stories they had shared with me, I knew that these women were sort of renowned for being exceptionally modest, for being incredibly self-deprecating, never taking a compliment for themselves. And I love the idea of white work as being a very quiet way in which they could have a means of self-expression. And around the time too, we haven't really spoken about this yet, around the time too that I realized that I didn't just want to have a friendship between these women. I wanted to have characters who were in love with each other, not a romantic friendship, a completely sort of clear-eyed love. I thought, well, what an incredible metaphor. Because one of the reasons why I wanted to include this kind of love story was because these, queer love is so often not unseen in the historical records and archives. It's not there. We know it's there, but it's not there. And so that was one of the reasons why I thought, oh, white work is such an apt metaphor for that. You know, you have to come close, so close. You have to look so closely to find it. And even then there's only the suggestion of these stories. And so it seemed a very natural thing to incorporate in the lives of my female characters.
Oh, thank you for that. I think that's a beautiful metaphor. And I think as people are reading it, they'll get even more out of the mentions of white stitch through it. So thank you. That's beautiful. Now, just in terms of how does devotion fit with, how does devotion speak to the other two books that you've written? Like, what kind of conversation do you think the three books would have?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't really think of them like that. I think I often feel that that's perhaps, you know, the prerogative of the reader to look at the work of a writer and to sort of think, gosh, they just really won't let up about that theme, will they? I mean, because I don't really think about them in those terms when I'm writing them. I'm not thinking, oh, how will this book fit in with my other ones? Or what are my preoccupations as a writer? I'm just in it. I'm just with the stories. And so much of my writing is, particularly the initial drafts, are just kind of me just trying to get they're an emotional write in the sense that it's about me trying to capture the kind of feelings that these characters have or what's happening. They're not necessarily plot heavy. Often the plot is very ragged in there. It's very much about character and what they're feeling and what they want. And then the plotting comes later in the refinement of character after that, in the rewrites. And I tend to do lots of rewrites. And so, yeah, I'm not sure. I think maybe I do have an interest in the idea of an outsider, the idea of people on the periphery and on the margins. I do, of course, know that I'm very interested in the lives of women within a historical context, particularly women who belonged to poorer classes or had lower social standing, mainly because those stories are just not there. I don't think it's necessarily an interrogation of lived female experience or anything like that. I think it's just because I want to know. Those are the kinds of, women are present in historical records, but often when it's women, representing themselves, these women are, highly literate or women of means, or women who are, have some sort of agency in their own lives. And I think I'm really interested in the ways in which women in the past have not had that, and the way that they've tried to kind of exercise control over their lives or to find happiness or to belong when that isn't necessarily easily available to them, if that makes sense. So I think that's probably an ongoing interest, but yeah, I'm not sure what conversations the three books would have together.
Well, because the other thing that struck me was certainly nature and a strong sense of place, but there's also religion. So what does religion, and in particular this book, nature, like the natural environment, what does that mean to you, like religion and where we live?
I think I write about religion always finds its way into my books, I think because it formed such a huge part of people's lives. So I think for me, including religion and it's sort of, it's a power structure that existed, I think, in the lives of many people, especially of a sort of peasant or labouring class. I don't use the word peasant with sort of inverted commas, because it was just a huge part of people's lives, not only in the sense of faith and belief, which was much stronger back then, but also in an administrative sense. These were the places you got married in a church. The pastor was often the greatest authority that you would have direct contact with, all of these sorts of things. So partly it's just about trying to be historically accurate. But I think also the way in which it ties in with landscape is perhaps a more subtle interest of mine or a more personal one. I love writing landscape. I find it quite difficult, and so I really like to try and capture some of the qualities that I so love about it. It's a pleasurable thing for me to do as a writer. So that's probably why it's also there. But I think too, it might also just be in an effort to show the ways in which the landscape was much more closely entwined with the lives of people who lived agrarian lives, I think. You know, your health and your wealth would be dictated by weather and seasons. You lived very seasonally. So it seems a very natural fit to bring in landscape and make it very, you know, and to have a very strong presence in this book, because that's what you find in Proverbs, in sort of accounts and local stories. The weather and the land is always there because it is so important. So I think maybe those are things. But yeah, definitely I might embellish landscape a little bit more just because I just love to write it.
Well, you do it so well. Now, don't forget to send questions through on the chat, and I'll be able to ask Hanne your questions in a few minutes. So get typing if there's questions that you would like to ask her. Now's your chance. So I'll just a quick question, and then I might get you to do a reading. So it's just, as a non-writer, I am endlessly fascinated by the physical act of writing, like the daily practice. So what's your daily practice?
Oh, you know, Fiona, I don't even know anymore. I used to be such a diligent writer, because I was initially writing burial rights as part of a PhD, and then I had the good fortune of being able to more or less write the good people most days of the week. And I would have this, you know, kind of dedication to it, or this discipline where I would be at the desk at 8:30 and I would just write 1,000 words when working on a first draft, and then only then get to other work or other commitments. But writing devotion, I had 2 children throughout the writing of devotion, and had all sorts of things interrupt my day, from, you know, being hospitalized for morning sickness to, you know, being hugely fatigued, as, you know, any new parent of a baby will tell you. And then, you know, parenting 2 very little children and who can reach the doorknob of my study at home and don't understand no, and like to sit at my desk and draw on my research papers. You know, it's a much more sort of disorganized, chaotic process. So I think I'm still, I guess, you know, a mother of young children trying to work out how to get back to writing and how to develop a routine or something which is, you know, continuous and constant. I think I really struggled with the loss of momentum writing this book. But, you know, I think actually all those experiences have probably made me a stronger writer, in that they've allowed, you know, I used to require, you know, music which was atmospherically aligned to what I was writing, or total silence. And, you know, now I can like inhabit the 19th century with Bluey squealing in the background. So, you know, I think that can only be a good thing, but I'm a little bit less precious about it.
Well, you've set the scene for us. You've shown us these wonderful characters that I know readers are going to love getting to know. You've kind of given the background to the story. Can you now do a reading for us and set the scene?
Yeah, sure. I might read a bit about when Hanne's congregation, when they all reach when they're on their way to the land which has been allocated them in the Mount Lofty Ranges. So they're already in South Australia, and this is a bit of landscape writing, seeing as we've been talking about it. The sound of this country is one long sustained note that does not end. It is a humming that holds all the other music of this place in harmony. Every other sound is threaded upon it. It was at the port that I began to curate new litanies. Between the bullock drivers that rumbled in from Adelaide, the sailors, the merchants, the English come in search of labourers, I found words given to the music I heard against the constant run of the wind amongst the rushes and sand dunes. She-oak for the tree with long-scaled needles, whistling the wind in a way that made my skin lift. Magpie lark for the 2 shriek cooling peep in changing hours. Salt paperbark for the crooked trees groaning wooded cupped fruit. Mangrove, wattle, saltbush. In the months that came afterwards, I learned new words as the congregation did, as we all did, as we crossed the dusty ticking plains of Adelaide. I placed them next to one another upon the deeper vibration of this country. Galah, cockatoo, lorikeet, kangaroo, wallaby, possum, emu, goanna, quoll. And now, years later, sitting on the lip of this valley, I can make prayer beads of the trees that crown me, the small living things glimpsed if I am still and silent, red gum, blue gum, quandong, stringy bark. And the birds, ever here, ever singing, a liturgy to govern the hours towards gods of cry and shriek and call. Kookaburra, magpie, shrike thrush, wagtail, currawong, crow, bubuk. Scripture may no longer roll off my tongue in smooth certainty, but my mouth is still full of spirit. Holy writ of living things, each one a prayer against the teeth. Nature had always been my whetstone, had always made me keener, and after we reached the foothills, I felt myself sharpen. The landscape on the ascent to the ranges was unlike anything I had ever seen before. I had thought the pine forest back in Kay a place of divinity, but this country was infinitely more sovereign. Each morning, while it was yet dark, the birds filled the air with singing, so that the sun, when it rose, brought light as symphony. The birds were everywhere, hosts of raucous angels, black-bodied, yellow-topped messengers of shrieking delight, soot-streaked coral masters, feather-fat kookaburras suddenly, alarmingly proselytizing to the dawn. Even the trees grew in such a way as to welcome the sun to the world. In Prussia, canopies were dense and thick, forest floors were deeply shadowed. Here was a place of lightness. Leaves dappled thin and shiny, fluttered pink, grey, green. I crushed them in my palm and smelled medicine, healing. Hot, still days dropped branches, all bone crack, and brought the sounds of bees. Sometimes I smelled honey warming the air. Animals were muscled fur and liquid eyes, or scaly thicknesses, tongues darting. All of it, trees and possums and kangaroos and bright beads of ants circling trunks, veered from stillness to flashing movement in an instant. There was energy here, rough softness. Sometimes it rained, and when it stopped, the air was perfume, a clean scent of wet leaf and damp sweetness. I wanted to drink that washed summer air. I imagined it tasted of reprieve.
Oh, so beautiful, so beautiful. I think that gives our listeners a real sense of what's ahead of them. And this is a story that is so steeped in love, and it's got such a strong poetic nature to the writing. So congratulations, Hannah. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona.
Well, we look forward to one time when we can welcome you back to Avid Reader, so you can come and visit us again.
Oh, I can't wait. That would be wonderful.
Any questions? Okay, I think that just a question about the films that the book's been turned into films. How involved are you in that process?
So burial rights, not particularly. It's still happening. I occasionally get emails with news, but still very much in pre-production. The Good People, I've been writing some drafts of the script for, which has been really interesting. So that's still moving ahead as well. And I've also, after The Good People, I also wrote an original screenplay, which is a film which should hopefully be shot quite soon. So current circumstances have kind of delayed it somewhat, but that will be a film called Run Rabbit Run, and it's a psychological thriller set not in historical times, set in contemporary South Australia. So something a little bit different.
Oh, I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. Okay, we've had a question come through from Wanda. Religion colours your stories along with pagan or mystical themes, but it never dominates the story. How do you manage the mix?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure how I manage it, to be honest. I'm glad that you think I do. I think it's I think pagan ideas or sort of a greater mysticism often come in, because I think whenever I'm researching or reading about religion in the past, you always find these other folkloric elements there. It seems to be quite a natural balance. For every sort of account I hear of how religious people were and the nature of their services, inevitably you hear folk stories, or you hear accounts of people suspected of occult behaviors, and so it seems natural to include the both of them, sometimes as oppositional, opposing forces, and sometimes as kind of one and the same thing weaved into the faiths and beliefs of the people. And it's something I think that I'm also very interested about. I think any kind of faith or belief system just reveals so much about humans, right? It reveals about all sorts of things about what we're afraid of and what we love and what we aspire to be. And so I think it religion is worthy of deeper examination, not necessarily for its own sake, but what it says of people who cling to it.
Mm. And we've got a question from Vicky. Vicky says, is there another book concept in the works? I'll be finished this one soon.
Vicky, it took me 5 years. Thank you. That's really lovely. I do have actually quite a lot of projects in mind. Some of them will be dependent on how free I am to research them. I have some which are not set in Australia, and so that I've been sort of researching as well as I can while I'm here, but they will require me to go overseas. I'm interested in returning to the Nordic countries, and that's probably as much as I'll say about some of those. And I also have a non-fiction book in mind, which I've been working on. But as I say, I'm sort of sitting with all of these various interests and projects, and I'll see which one is time to write, because I'm also not sure exactly what form they should take. Now that screenwriting is potentially an option, some of them might be better suited to film. So we'll see. But yeah, more than enough to go on with. So I'll try and work a bit faster.
Get cracking for Vicky.
Yeah.
And so Courtney asks along that line, how do you manage the research of historical figures and then make them as realistic as possible?
Well, that's again a really good question. Research doesn't always offer, I think, a true depiction of someone from the past. Particularly, I think, if you're looking at a very pervasive or dominant historical narrative, it's always coloured to prejudice or ideologies, and there's always so much which is missing. I think that's one of the reasons why I really love discovering information about, the domestic world, because it's often with a much more relatable sort of incidents or behaviours. And it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier in terms of religion. If someone really believes in something, you wonder what it offers them. I think it's maybe just about scratching the surface a little bit. And also, researching really hard and in a tangential way, and maybe thinking a little bit outside the box so that you can finally discover these accounts of human meltdowns and petty conflicts, because that's when you discover, a very recognizable human face. I think I'm also very interested too in exploring what I would consider to be universal emotions. Things like grief and love, I don't think have really changed that much. I think the way we express these things has changed. I think their role in terms of whether they're socially acceptable or not changes. All these sorts of things happen, but I think essentially the emotion has remained constant. And I think if you can find ways to examine those emotions and how they play out amongst your historical characters, that's one way of making them seem very contemporary and understandable.
And then Roz says, thanks, Hannah, for writing such beautiful books. I'm loving Devotion, not finished yet. Will there be a sequel? Does it lend itself to continuing the journey through generations of the characters?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have actually thought about it for this book. There's a few characters in this novel which I really love, and I sometimes wish they had a little bit more room in there to explore their side of the story. But yeah, I'll add it to the list of potential future projects. But maybe I haven't ruled it out, actually. And it's the first time I've ever written something. I thought, oh yeah, maybe I could continue with this. Yeah.
And Michelle says, thank you, Hannah, for reading us that beautiful passage and sharing your insights. She can't wait to read the book.
Oh, thank you, Michelle.
And then a final question, and that is from Susan. And Susan wants to know what you're reading at the moment.
Oh, good question. I'm reading quite a few things, actually. I am listening to Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia. I am reading Sarah Moss's The Fell, which is her newest book. I'm a big fan of Sarah Moss's work. I'm trying to picture my bedside table. I'm also reading A Well-Gardened Mind, which is a non-fiction book all about gardening, which I've just started and I'm really enjoying. So that's just what I can think of off the top of my head. But yeah, there's so many amazing books that I've got a very big to buy books list, to borrow books list. There's been so many great books released recently. So
and then
lots to look forward to.
both of us love Diana Reid's Love and Virtue as well.
Yeah, really enjoyed that book. Oh, and I'm also reading Charlotte Wood's The Luminous Solution, which is fantastic as well. So yeah, really enjoyed
Well, it's certainly been a wonderful year for books, and I know our readers are going to love devotion so much. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for everybody around Australia for joining us. Thank you for coming to the watch party. Thank you to Picador for organising Hannah's appearance. Thank you to Jana, who has been kind of moderating this and me. Can I ask you, I think Jana will let us all off mute, and then we can all join me in thanking the wonderful Hannah Kent. I think that's what Jana is doing now, unless maybe she's not. Maybe we can all just do this kind of clapping and wish you all the very, very best. Oh no, here we go. Lovely. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.